So we have the pleasure of having Jessyn Farrell with us tonight. She has had a very active public life. She's been involved in private enterprise. She's been involved in public matters, nonprofits, philanthropic things. She advocated, she led advocacy efforts resulting in billions of dollars in regional light rail investments as executive director of Transportation Choice Coalition. And she is currently, I've got it here. She's currently.
I'm happy to introduce myself.
Have you met yourself?
I have.
Okay. All right. So I'm just going to stumble through this for 2 more minutes and turn it over to you. Jessyn is going to talk to us about her recent trip to Buenos Aires to attend the C40 City Climate Summit. She's currently the director of the Office of Sustainability and Environment for the city of Seattle. And C40 Cities is a global network of mayors whose shared purpose is to take action to confront the climate crisis and to create a future where everyone can thrive. I didn't mention it, but I'm Stu Heller, the moderator of these speakers forums. And I'm adrift out here somewhere in the ocean, which I thought somehow had something to do with climate. So, Jessyn, please tell us about your trip. I think it's very appropriate since the COP20 summit is going on, and it's all yours.
Okay, well, good evening, everyone. I'm Jessyn Farrell. I know many of you know I am a former state legislator. I ran, as Stu mentioned, Transportation Choices Coalition. I've been a transit geek and advocate my whole life, but definitely my professional life. And I now am the director of the Office of Sustainability and Environment for the city of Seattle. And it is such an awesome, fantastic job, and I love it. And so thank you for joining us tonight, Stu. Thank you for inviting me. I just got to go on a really interesting and exciting trip to Buenos Aires, where the it's called the C40 network. It's a network of actually 80 city mayors who are focused on pushing the envelope on combating climate change. And this network of cities was founded during the Trump administration. The idea was that cities with, if our federal government wasn't going to be acting in, particularly during the Trump era, it was really going to be up to cities and states, but in this particular network, cities to really be on the forefront of decarbonizing our energy, our transportation, and our entire lifestyle. So I thought what I would do today is talk a little bit about what the city of Seattle is doing, share some pictures of Buenos Aires because it's a beautiful city, and talk about some of the exciting things that I learned that other cities are doing, and then open it up for questions. So I don't plan on talking too long, but we can have a little bit of a conversation. So first of all, let's talk about what the city of Seattle is doing and what my office does. We are charged with implementing and driving climate policy for the city, and we are implementing our One Seattle Climate Justice agenda. And climate justice, to me, is really about who is at the table and centering communities that have faced really the brunt of environmental injustices, systemic racism, economic injustice, and are bearing the brunt of climate change. And in our community, folks who live in South Park and Georgetown, Beacon Hill, Rainier Valley, Lake City, those are some of the neighborhoods that are experiencing significant emissions through transportation, disinvestment over many, many decades because of racist land use policies, et cetera. And so climate justice as a frame is about really centering and putting in a policymaking role those folks who've been impacted. And so it's not just what we're doing, it's how we're doing it. And so that's a little bit about the how, and the what we're focused on is transitioning and building an equitable green economy so that we are really driving policies that are about reorienting particularly wealth in our community. Many of you know that there is a wealth gap in the city, with white residents having 10 times the family wealth as Black residents of our community, as an example. So our economic policies within the context of climate change are about really undoing and changing that allocation of wealth. We are creating a transition from a carbon economy to a green economy. And in Seattle, that's all about decarbonizing transportation, which is almost 67% of our emissions, and decarbonizing buildings, which is another big chunk of our emissions. And then thirdly, it's about climate resiliency. Climate change is already happening. And so making sure that people have safe air to breathe in the next smoke event, making sure that people are safe from floods and from heat. And so that's the other part of what we're doing. So I just wanted to ground that, because we are coming to this with a really big, ambitious agenda, and we're racing against the clock at this point. And so we went to this conference in part to learn from other cities and other mayors, and also to receive an award for the work that we're doing through our Green New Deal Oversight Board, which is a community-oriented board of 19 members, and they are really helping us make decisions around how we invest, particularly the payroll expense tax. And so the city of Seattle received an award for that, which is really exciting. And to me, it's really about like the beginning of our work, not any kind of endpoint. So that's a little context. I am actually going to now share my screen and attempt to show you a few pictures, just because Buenos Aires is a beautiful city, and I just want you to feel a little bit of that. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what I learned. So let's take a quick look at some pictures. Let's see if this works. Share screen, we're doing it. Here it goes. And how many years are we now into COVID? So we should all be awesome. Okay, so I'm just going to start this. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Yay, good job. Okay, so this is just a view of the city. As you can see, it has quite a bit of density. As an urbanist, I love seeing that. But it also has green space, as you can see in this. It's a really wonderful mix of lots and lots of people and really beautiful public spaces. So that's one view. So you can just see a little bit of the density. It's a really exciting place from that perspective. Here's a street level view. As you can see, there's a real mix of architecture. This, looks like it's Beaux-Arts or some kind of turn of the 20th century. And then you have more of a mid-century modern building. You have classic mixed use, where you have commercial right on the ground floor, and then housing up above. So it has, I kind of thought of it as looking a little bit like Paris and Washington, D.C. It had that feel of a planned city. It had a little bit of a Miami Art Deco feeling, and then clearly, it is a Latin American city. So a lot of those influences as well. And again, the public spaces are just delightful. This is a picture of a bridge that was near the conference center that we were in. And orange and pink happened to be my very favorite color combination. And so I really loved seeing this bridge. And then, of course, because it is Buenos Aires, we got to see a tango performance, which was really a lot of fun. And I think those were the pictures that I had. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to just set the stage a little bit. We got to spend time with mayors from around the world, but not only were we hanging out with, like in my world, like the absolute rock stars, like the mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, the mayor of Paris, who is Anne Hidalgo, and the mayor of the mayor of London has done really exciting things around congestion pricing and creating low emission zone. It looks like Elizabeth has a question. Nope. Oh, fake question. Okay, well, we'll get to, if you do have a question, I hope you do have a question. So again, in my world, like these are the rock stars. It was really fun. And, Anne Hidalgo, I don't know if you've been to Paris in recent years, but has really transformed the city into this place where you have rivers of bicyclists. And, and her point was very inspiring, which was, you just do it and people get mad and then they get used to it. And then they discover how much they like it. And so I just loved her very pragmatic attitude about change. We don't like to change, but oftentimes we end up with something that we like even more. But I do want to share that there were actually mayors who weren't able to come. And for example, the mayor of Karachi in Pakistan could not come because he is managing a massive, massive flood that is absolutely because of climate change and really sheds light on the deep injustice around a country like that has so little impact on climate relative to a country like ours. I want to acknowledge the mayor of Chengdu in China, who was not able to come because she was still under COVID lockdown and not able to travel. A mayor of Freetown in Sierra Leone, the national government would not let her travel because they did not want to give her a platform to talk about the amazing things that are happening in Freetown in Sierra Leone. And she was actually arrested and put in jail just days before the conference. So I say these things because we have a great deal of privilege in this city. There's a great deal of inequality, but there is a very robust and still healthy, thanks to the last election, we demonstrated that civil society, and we shouldn't take that for granted. Sorry, Stu, what was that?
Yippee.
Yippee, as they say, hashtag yippee.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, other mayors who were there are dealing with tremendous burdens. The mayor of Santiago in Chile has 900,000 refugees from Venezuela that they are accommodating. The mayor of Warsaw, who is on the very front lines of, kind of Putin's Russia and the propaganda war. He was like, how do you deal with like we have a misinformation flood happening in our country, but I think what's happening in a city like Warsaw is even deeper and more profound. So I just share that because it really threw into a very stark relief the wealth that we have, the robust civil society that we have, and that really the only thing that is in the way is ourselves. And so it actually leaves me with a lot of optimism because we actually can change what we're doing. So the other thing I want to, so I'm going to share some of the policies that we learned from other cities that I'm really excited about, but I also just want to share the context. We are in this historic moment where the federal government has enacted not just one, but two bills that have a lot of infrastructure funding that the city is well positioned to go after. The state has enacted through the Climate Commitment Act funding, and the city through the Jumpstart tax. So we're in this place where our challenge now is how quickly can we scale what we're doing? And so that's what I am spending a lot of time thinking about and working with my team, so that we're not doing 300 clean heat oil conversions a year, but doing 3,000 and then moving on to 30,000 natural gas conversions a year so that we can actually hit our goals. So it's just to say, though, that we have tremendous opportunity, and I'm very, very, I don't want to say optimistic, but I have a lot of enthusiasm, and there is a pathway for this enthusiasm. So I'm going to just talk about a couple of policies that I'm excited about, and then I am going to open it up to questions for all of you. So we had a chance to meet with our colleagues from Chicago, and they also have built a lot of bike infrastructure in recent years, and they've invested a lot in green spaces. And one of the most amazing things they've done is create a social impact bond, where they are leveraging the kind of climate commitments that companies are making and using those commitments to fund a low or no yield bond that's issued by the city. And they recently did this and raised $800 million that they are putting towards various climate efforts, but in particular, building affordable housing in downtown. Literally what they're doing is they're buying their empty office towers. They're having a design competition, and they are going to be retrofitting streets of buildings for affordable housing. So that's really cool and exciting. And I think that that's something that we can begin to explore in Seattle as a way of unlocking, really significant amounts of funding, in addition to the funding that's already out there. So I just thought that was really cool. The other thing that C40, through Sadiq Khan, Mayor of London, Mayor Khan's leadership, is he is a proselytizer for their congestion zone. And the reason is that, a congestion zone, just for those of you who don't know or want a refresher, is they basically drew a line around the center of London, and they put a price on entering. So you have to pay to enter the center of the city. And now, center of the City of London has awesome transit, the tube, really it's a dense walkable community. So there are different ways to get in and out of town. And they treat delivery differently than they treat regular drivers. They have great bus service. But the amount of emissions that have been reduced, and the particulate matter that cause, chronic respiratory diseases like asthma, has been really significantly reduced. And so C40 is providing some resourcing to cities like Seattle, and we are working with them right now to explore this around what would a low emission zone in our community look like? Again, given political context, given land use, and in particular, the political context is that congestion pricing and fees on transportation can often be inequitable, in the sense that people who have to drive because they live outside of the city and can't afford to live in the city for their work or for whatever it is that they're doing, they end up bearing the brunt. So the policy question for Seattle is, how do you get the emissions benefits of certain pricing ideas, and yet implement it in a way where you have you have progressivity built into it? So we're exploring that. And so one of the ways I'm thinking about this, and we're working with partner departments and others, and you're hearing it here first, Robin, especially, hello, by the way, and welcome, is how might we take a geographic area and braid together all of the different programming that we're doing around decarbonizing someone's home and putting in, a clean heat pump, weatherization, so that the person has clean indoor air, and all of our programming around the stuff that we can control, particularly around transportation, so that when somebody walks outside of their house, they have clean outdoor air as well, at least to the extent that we can control, right? Like a fire event is a little outside of the city's control, but in terms of the regular year-round emissions, we do have a lot of impact that we can make on that. So we're looking at what would it look like to kind of stack together a whole series of policy supports in a really intensive way in those communities like South Park or Georgetown or South Beacon Hill, that are really bearing a lot of the environmental justice brunt, but also that goes directly into a lot of the climate emissions front as well. So that's something that I'm particularly excited about. And I'm just going to keep talking about this for another moment because I am very excited about it. We have successfully used pricing in our community to impact how we get around. I look at how many people here are familiar with the UPass program at UW? You can raise your hand. So the UPass program was implemented in the early 90s, and it was to solve for a really major transportation problem that the UW had. 70% of people were driving alone. And that was causing all kinds of problems. And so they did three things. They raised parking prices. They contracted with Metro to make sure there was great transit service all around the region. And they gave the UW community almost a nearly free bus pass called the UPass. And within a couple of years, the mode shift had completely changed so that only 30% of people were driving alone. Mm-hmm. So this is important. This is an important story because we actually can align policies to encourage different kinds of behavior. And we can do it in a way that is great and is like product focused, as opposed to we're going to make you pay a whole bunch of money in a time when people are actually facing rising costs, and it is very significant. How can we create a policy solution that's actually lowering people's costs and helping them do whatever it is that they need to do? So we're kind of borrowing, as we're thinking about this kind of way of thinking, we're borrowing from London's low emission zone. We're thinking about the way Barcelona has done super blocks. We are thinking about the eco district advocacy that's happening on Capitol Hill. And we are being really opportunistic and thinking about what might we apply in our own political context and our own built environment context to drive investments in our neighborhoods that really fundamentally decarbonize, create safe places for people to be in the event of a climate event, and fundamentally are co-created with community, because that at the end of the day is what climate justice is about. So we're in the midst of taking that work and doing our homework, and we'll be talking about it publicly really soon. So those are some of the things that I wanted to share about my trip to Buenos Aires. And I guess I'll just leave in closing that Seattle at its best, to me, is a city when we are open to ideas, open to the ideas of other cities, open to new people. And there's a really rich history of international exchange. And I just want to encourage all of us to have a global outlook in what we're thinking about. And of course, with respect to climate change, because of the deep inequities and the deep justice issues that are so built into our climate crisis. So I am going to close and thank you all again for giving me a chance to talk about what was a really wonderful experience and a really educational and inspiring experience. And I am happy to take questions.
Yes, and I have one.
Okay.
Tell us about the award that Seattle got. What did it do and why did it receive the award and who gave it?
So the C40 conference, as I said, is a network of cities, and there is a steering committee of mayors. There is actually a staff that staffs it, because the idea is that mayors, a lot of our, as I said at the outset, a lot of our climate action is at the city level, and that peer-to-peer exchange is really, really important. And so there were a variety of categories, but the category that we were given an award for was building a climate movement, and how are we co-creating decision-making with the community. And I have a 9-year-old who just came in, so I'm going to ask him to write me a note, because we have a very highly developed program. Except I don't have a pen, Julian, so you're going to have to find a pen and write me a note. This is well developed during COVID. We created a system where they could communicate with me while I was on Zoom. They write a note, I respond. So anyway, little digression over here. Did I see it? Did I answer your question, Stu? So that was a little bit about the award.
Okay, who gave the award? The C40?
C40 did, and as a just a little more context, the C40 network is funded primarily by Bloomberg Philanthropies and staffed by Bloomberg Philanthropies. So there is, like I said, there is a steering committee of mayors that at the end of the day is really kind of the drivers of the work. But there is also staff that is paid for by philanthropies, in part Bloomberg Philanthropies.
So did we have to submit
We did, yes, exactly. So
an application?
yes, exactly. Yep.
I see. And did you have any part in creating that, or?
Yeah, well, my staff did. So
Uh-huh.
folks who are doing the work at OSC. Yep.
Good work.
I'm actually going to piggyback on that. I don't think you explained much about what it was for the Green New Deal Oversight Board.
Yes, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that. So you all may recall that when Councilmember Mike O'Brien was on the city council, he, with a number of community advocates and a number of council members, Councilmember Shama Sawant was really instrumental in creating a Green New Deal for Seattle. And then Councilmember Mosqueda was the leader who really made the payroll expense tax happen. So the Green New Deal Oversight Board is a group of 19 community members that span frontline communities, indigenous communities, labor, who are helping influence and co-create our climate investments. And anyone can serve on the board and apply. So if you are interested, that is good. But the idea is that historically, communities that are impacted by systemic racism, communities that are impacted by climate emissions, have been left out of policymaking. And so this creates a structure for the city and through my office to be in regular consultation and communication with this board, who, again, has an array of experiences and expert. There are scientists on the board, for example, and they help provide recommendations. And this is actually the first year that we've done this, so it's very brand new. But recommendations on, for example, how we spend climate dollars in the city. So that's a little bit about this. And so the idea again is, how do you, from a really kind of deep and systemic way, build in meaningful community-driven policy making? Because and kind of behind that, even a deeper layer, is that all of us deserve to have agency over our lives, and that people who have been left out have not had that opportunity to have agency, and that we have the opportunity to really create a structure that allows for that kind of co-created policymaking. So again, this has been up and running literally since about last fall. And so we just completed our first budget, set of budget recommendations, and we're almost completed with the budget process. And so this way of co-creating policy was recognized because it is not a typical way of policymaking in cities who are part of this network. Other questions? Yes, Elizabeth.
I'd actually love to know, if you're okay talking about it, I'd love to know a little more of the basic things about the Green New Deal Oversight Board. For example, I mean, do they come up with ideas of stuff they want you to do, or do you say, here's what we're thinking of doing, and they give you feedback? I mean,
so it's a little bit of both. So the Green New Deal Oversight Board was constituted about a year ago, and they started by creating a set of principles that would drive their work. And they're more or less, they're very similar to what I was talking about at the beginning. They're not exactly the same, but providing access to a green economy, a just transition, healthy, resilient communities. Those are all themes that the Green New Deal Oversight Board is using to assess how it's going to engage in policymaking. And so the budget, so this is the first year, but the council last year set aside a portion of its budget to engage the Green New Deal Oversight Board to create a set of recommendations around how the city should allocate budget dollars. And there were a number of recommendations, and we took many of them. For example, I'll give one example. We need to make sure that we are both decarbonizing our buildings and at the same time making sure that people who may not have access to an air-conditioned facility or access to a place that has safe air in a climate event have a place in their community that they can go access information, they can pick up fans, they can even just hang out there and be cool. So we are calling these climate resiliency hubs. And this was an idea that came from community and that they recommended that the city embrace and start to fund. So that's a really concrete example of a specific policy idea that we had not been working on until literally this year. And now we are creating a climate resilience hub strategy for the entire city so that every single we're starting with frontline neighborhoods and those neighborhoods that have experienced systemic racism. But the idea is that every single person in our community should have clean air. And if we can't, ultimately clean air in your own home, like that's where we need to get to. But in the interim, as we're decarbonizing our building stock in our homes, you should have a place where you can have access to clean air in your neighborhood. You should have a place where you can access information. Let's say your power goes out. You should have a place where you can store your food or go get access to food and water. And so, and some of those places will be community centers and libraries. Some of those places will be churches or community-owned buildings. And so our role over the next year is to really explore and to develop a strategy around and to listen more to community around what do people actually need. One of the preliminary things we're learning, and this makes very common sense, is that the kinds of support that a person who is unhoused needs, or a person who is elderly, or a person with small children can be very different. And so how are we creating programming within a center that meets the needs of various people who might need it? So that is a really specific example of how our policy making is radically shifting because of this board. And it's really exciting. And there are all kinds of innovative ways that we can provide community resilience. And so we're going to be exploring that and working with the board to really implement and develop a great strategy.
Thank you.
Yes, great questions. Yes, Elizabeth.
Hi. Well, on that note, there already is a web in the city of emergency centers in case of earthquake, etc. I'm a ham radio operator and we're tied in with the emergency network. But there are these community centers already there. So are you going to fold in with those, or will set up a separate system?
No, again, the idea is to build on what we have and to start to transform it so that it is even better meeting the needs of our community.
Good.
And to recognize that an earthquake emergency is potentially really different than a heat wave or a smoke event, and even in the interim, like we have colleagues in Barcelona that are actually starting to really implement resiliency hubs. And one of the things that they do is they actually have technical expertise and experts who work at the resilience hub, and a neighbor can walk down the street and learn more about what resources are available to decarbonize their own home. So it is, and then other communities, we're also really interested in community resilience. Isn't just safety during an emergency, it's the connections that we have. I mean, we're part of that Alef, right? We have this community that is around us. And so how are we making investments in these facilities that are creating year-round resilience? And one of the things that I'm also thinking about is housing stability, and what a core part of community resilience housing stability and affordability is.
Mhm.
And that we really can't talk about climate justice without weaving in the affordability and stability
Sure.
conversation as well. So,
Another question relates to trees.
yay.
In terms of being discriminatory, our canopy was a great example during the heat wave of the inequity in our city.
100%.
And I know there's been some work that the city council has done recently relating to the trees. You want to explain a little bit about that?
Yep. So my office is charged with doing a study every 6 years on our tree canopy. And we are assimilating the data. So we have very high level data. We're getting down into the details. But one of the things that we know, which is no surprise, is that there is a major tree canopy inequity in our community, and that the places that do not have trees are also the places that have suffered from systemic racism and other kinds of economic and other ways that we create hierarchy in our community. And so we, as a consequence of this data, we're going to be doing a tree canopy equity plan that will then help guide our investments so that we have, that we're remedying that. And it's really stark across our community, and trees are a really important way to help keep people cool.
Mhm.
And I will just say, as you all know, I am a fervent urbanist, and I believe deeply that it is a false choice to choose between housing and trees. We can and should have both. A city needs people, and people need stable, affordable housing, and we need trees. We have to be able to do both. And so we're really excited about this work in the coming year to basically lay out a strategy and then go after the funding to make it happen.
Another question relates to the political structure.
Yeah.
There was a movement to have an assistant mayor who would oversee legislation from a climate perspective, so that any legislation, any changes in the government, it would be run through that person so that he or she could say, well, this is how it impacts climate change, and have some influence. Well, the idea, it didn't make it. So there's so many disparate parts of government, even with trees. I was reading in the Times, all these different departments relate to trees. There's no coordinated body. Same with climate. And if you have more dense housing one place, or you have transportation hubs, it all interlocks, and it all relates to climate change. But there's no one. I was thinking maybe your department, but so far there's been nobody who said, well, let's look at this through the lens of climate before we pass the legislation and do the numbers. So
yeah,
is that partly what you'll be doing?
Yeah. So governance is really tricky. And it is, I'm not going to give a really satisfactory answer, Elizabeth, except I feel like my job, more than almost anything, is to be an internal organizer. Office of Sustainability and Environment is what I call a soft power agency. You know, we don't control big budgets, but we are very charming, and we are really good at getting people aligned. And so that is like my first, I have a lot of top things I need to do right away. But one of those things is getting our capital departments, particularly our transportation, SDOT, in alignment with our climate commitments, because we've done the plans. We actually know exactly what we need to do. Like, we need to decarbonize our residential buildings, our commercial buildings, and we need to electrify our transportation and give people options to get out of their cars. You know, those are the things we need to do. And and I will say, beyond that, there are things around circular economy, decarbonizing the stuff that we use to build, like that is all very real too. And I want to acknowledge that, but there is some very low hanging fruit in the city community, in the city family, around how we make decisions. And we are actually working really closely with the mayor and the mayor's office and our partner departments to get alignment on that. And we're going to be making some things public soon that are around that. And so, you know, so there is that question, like you could be in a situation where we consolidated all of the capital spending. But I think even more important, we need to make sure that our capital spending is aligned with our climate goals. And I'm less concerned about kind of multiple points, because in some ways, having multiple departments all take responsibility for it is a good thing, so long as we are all aimed in the same direction. That is the key. And so, for example, with tree canopy, yes, our trees touch many, many departments. And one of the things that the council is considering is creating a chief urban forester that would be charged with aligning our tree canopy work across our departments and scaling it to what we need to do. So that's an example. Again, I think on the climate front, it is like, again, we know what the impact of transportation. 67% of our emissions in this city come from transportation. And so on the one hand, we have Seattle City Light working in partnership with OSE to create a transportation electrification implementation strategy. So literally, how are we going to do this? How, if you live in a condo and you do not have a charger in your condo, how are we going to help you get that charger in your condo? And how are we going to make sure the grid can take on that extra demand? So we will have a strategy that is available to the public sometime in 2023 that lays out the path for how we're doing that. But then there's all of these investments around getting people out of their cars, and the way a lot of cities, and the way even Seattle, like we have been tremendously successful when you look at like what happened with our pre-COVID, our downtown travel patterns. We added tens of thousands of jobs and not a new net drive alone trip in spite of those tens of thousands of jobs. So that's kind of actually a hidden success story. And so, but the question now is, given people are not going downtown in the same way, how do we shift the trips that people are making? And how do we do it and electrify? And how do we do it by 2035 or 2030, which is what our goal is? So those are the kinds of things that, you know, you're kind of raising this governance question, which is really important. And my belief, having been around the block on a lot of these policy discussions, is that we talk about governance when we're frustrated because not enough is getting done. That's what the monorail conversation was about. That's what has happened in the homelessness world. And I think our job and my job is to really move the ball, because that's all we can do. At the end of the day, we have no choice.
Thanks.
Yeah, you got it. Good question. Okay. Oh, Robin. Yep. And you know what? I'm going to go off screen really quickly and just plug in my computer because I noticed it's not plugged in and I don't want to suddenly disappear. So just hold on. I'll be right back. Oops. I'm back. Okay. I'm here. All right. Robin. Yes.
Yeah, I was going to ask, you know, C40, I think, is a really cool organization. And I'm kind of been curious as to how Seattle hooks into it. And this is also kind of a follow-on to what Elizabeth was asking, because one of the ideas that I heard about, like, is from Oslo. And they have a regular budget, just like every city. And they also have a climate budget. And what I haven't been following city politics that long, but it's clear that the budget is a huge forcing function because the budget has a balance. You only have so much money, you can only spend so much money. And what they've done in Oslo, and what I've heard that LA and Montreal are starting to do, is to have an actual climate budget where they sit down and they say, well, our climate plan, and this kind of goes along with what you were saying about getting alignment. Our climate plan says that we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by this much for the next year. What are we doing to make that happen?
Yeah.
Because I kind of look at the budget as people argue over it, and it's not clear, like there are all these things in it that are all climate related, but it's not clear what effect they have.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And I agree, a budget is a really powerful tool to drive policy. It not only reflects policy, it drives policy. It goes both ways. And there are definitely different ways of doing that. And Oslo does have that climate budget as a mechanism. There are also climate impact statements where you look at each, where you create an impact statement for each line item in the budget. That's another way of getting at it, so that you're starting to create an analytical framework for determining what is the best thing. And again, SDOT is starting to look at that, and I don't want to get out in front of them, but they are going to have some things to share around how they are starting to look at climate as part of their budgeting and their plans and their next set of proposals and policy fixes. And again, it really is in a lot of ways about transportation in the city of Seattle, given the 67%. And again, got to do the building decarbonization too. That's very real. But we are kind of more on a path around building decarbonization. But top line, I agree, budgets are really powerful tools. And I think the opportunity, but I will also say, budgets plus plans, because you need to know where you're going. And when we're in a moment of really significant federal and state funding as well, we need to be able to stack up a variety of funding sources so that we can tell the story of this is how we're going to decarbonize the tens of thousands of residential homes in Seattle. This is how we're going to electrify all of the condo buildings that do not have electric chargers currently, or this is how we're going to provide street infrastructure on charging, right? So those are the things that we need to sort out really quickly. We don't have a lot of time to figure it out, but we still have to figure it out, lay out the plan, and then align our budgets. Steve, I have not heard a question from you.
Hi, Jessyn. Thank you. This is really exciting what you're doing. I think there was wonderful and very provocative ideas. I'm just wondering, we're going through a transition in Seattle as elsewhere in post-COVID, where people's patterns of living are changing.
Yeah.
And I am two things. One, you recognize that people may be going downtown for different reasons, or their patterns going downtown. And the lack of people going downtown creates its own problems. I've got a little law office downtown, and staff don't want to come to work anymore. Women do not want to come to work because their perception that they get hassled. And so there is this sort of problem of getting people downtown, getting people back, active, so there's enough people on the streets, to make it vibrant. And I'm wondering how that fits in with what you're doing, as well as Seattle isn't a bubble. I mean, it's part of a regional area, and congestion pricing, which may work for London, which has no place that competes with London. We were just outside of London a couple of weeks ago, and I was asking a fellow I'm staying with, who's a high tech person, how congestion works, how it's working, and he had pretty good things to say about it. But then he observed that he only goes into London twice a year.
Yeah.
He lives 30 minutes away. And so these things are complicated, and so I just want to throw in the an aspiration that this is some regional look at how we optimize getting people to where they want to go, and create places where people can be and live with affordable housing and transportation.
I hear you 100%. And I'll just say, I want to be really clear that the way London has done pricing is not the way Seattle could ever do it. We're in a very, very different land use context, a different political context. Downtown is suffering. And I raised the UPass program as an entirely different way of thinking about incentives and disincentives, and that we need to invent something new that meets our needs in this era, and that it is probably not about downtown. We need to get people downtown, right? Like, it's a very different conversation. So I just want to really make sure that you hear that I'm not in any way proposing a cordon price around downtown, but that there are lots of really interesting things that we already do that align pricing and that actually have a really great impact on how people get around. And one of the, again, I'll just throw out some thoughts around that. The last mile problem. We have this beautiful new light rail infrastructure, but if you don't live right near the stop, it can be hard to get there. So how are we helping people easily, conveniently get to the light rail stop that's closest to their neighborhood, even if they live a mile away or a mile and a half away, and that's really too far to walk? So I don't have an answer to that, but that's the kind of question that I think we need to be asking ourselves and solving for from a policy standpoint. And then as for downtown, I will just also affirm we need to be really creative around how we get people downtown. So for example, I was at the Seattle Art Museum today. It was amazing. I had not been there since COVID. And we need to, do that kind of be a tourist in your own community type work to get all of us to get back downtown and use the wonderful things that we have in our space, even if we're not necessarily going down there to work. So there are a lot of different strategies to activate space, and we need to really lean into those because our downtown is very special and has a lot of really amazing things that we should all be using and enjoying. But great points. Very, very good points.
Thank you very much.
And also, just as a little note, I am going to quit soon. I have to go do a child pickup in just a little bit. That's how it goes. So why don't I take a comment from Elizabeth Burton and then Elizabeth Heath, and then we can wrap up. And as always, I'm happy to chat. So you know where to find me too. So how about Elizabeth Burton? You are on mute in the immortal words of the COVID era.
Thank you. So I first want to just say very quickly, you talked about making sure that condos have electric charging. I just wanted to throw in, make sure you also think about apartment buildings.
100%. And I was only using condos as a one minor example, but exactly, yes.
Okay. And then the main thing I actually wanted to ask about, I was very interested in your comment on, it was something about needing to get SDOT aligned with the city's climate goals. There was some mention of that. I do a lot of kind of activism around Port of Seattle activities. And I was wondering, is anyone, they have this, they're always promoting themselves as like the greenest port ever. But the truth is they're one of the biggest climate polluters in our state. And I don't know whether anyone has any
what are we doing?
Influence on them. Like, they're still, they're going to eventually supposedly have a green cruise corridor, like maybe 28 years from now, they'll all buy carbon offsets. But in the meantime, they're expanding.
Yeah.
And does your office, can you do anything? Can anyone do anything?
Well, those are great questions. And I would say at the end of the day, the Port of Seattle is about three things. It's about emissions from airlines and air traffic and the airport. It's about emissions from our trade and ships. And it's about emissions from transportation. So transporting cargo to and from logistics centers. So the city, and there are folks that are working on the emissions from air travel. Honestly, to go back to Steve's point, and this is not official city policy, but the airport would be a really good place to do a cordon price, to do to put a price around the store. You have to go there, and people have a lot of choices on how they're getting there. And a lot of people are driving. You could take transit. So that's an example of our political, or not our political context, because I'm not saying this on behalf of the city, merely talking about a particular policy idea. But that's an example of how you could deal with that. But what we do a lot of work around is diesel emissions from heavy duty trucks, because those are really, really impactful and dangerous and dirty and bad for people, really bad for people. And so we're working really closely with independent drayage truck drivers. A lot of these folks are refugees and immigrants from the Horn of Africa. And we are working on a pilot project to figure out how to electrify those trucks. And so we are creating an incentive, a tiered incentive program. We're going to be unrolling it soon. And that is one example of a place where the city can really have impact. The bigger corporate trucks are state, federal, the ports themselves, you know, the Alliance, Seattle and Tacoma, the Seaport Alliance. So there are things that the city can do, and we are really starting with kind of the most equity impacted truck drivers, because we feel like if that's a role, that's a gap that we can have a meaningful impact on. Okay, Elizabeth Heath, and then I am going to move
Okay.
on to the next phase of my evening, which is transportation related.
The other day, I was surprised to hear that the city could not pass certain legislation to regulate gun control because of limits placed on it by the state legislature.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, are there similar restrictions that as a city we face or you face in controlling climate change, response to climate change, where you're not allowed to because of state policy, and what can be done to change that?
You know, Elizabeth, that is such a good question. And I will say that there is so much low-hanging fruit of what we can do that I have not yet focused as much on what we can't do in terms of our advocacy, because like I said at the outset, the only thing that's in the way is ourselves at this point, and how fast and how quickly we can scale and how well we are building community trust. Because one of the tensions is that trust and scaling have different timelines. Trust is a slower, important process. Scaling in this moment, we need to go fast. So that's a tension that we have to navigate, but that isn't about any limitation that the state is putting on us. So yeah, I have all kinds of ideas around how the state could improve what we do, but it is now about how quickly can we run together to get to the finish. And there isn't really a finish line, but to start to actually deliver these milestones. And so it's a really interesting and very different policy space than gun violence. Although I will just say where it is similar is that with gun violence, all of the different causes for gun violence require different policy solutions. Suicide and the solutions around suicide are different from the solutions around youth gun violence, are different from the, you know, domestic violence and gun violence, police gun violence, right? So there are different sets of policy solutions that go with each of those areas, even though sometimes it feels like it's all, you know, what are we going to do about any one of these things? And it's the same thing about climate. We have this big global problem, but we can, you know, move it into discrete policy areas and move the ball forward.
So if there are some blocks that you encounter, some of us are quite politically active in our legislative districts.
That's great.
And have the ear of our legislators. So if we were made aware of those, if legislation was introduced, et cetera, and you needed support, please don't forget the local activists.
I love it. Great point. And I'll make sure that, you know, at some point we just share, the city is putting together its legislative agenda. So we'll make sure that we share that.
Thank you.
So that everyone can help move the ball forward.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for being here tonight.
You got it.
Yes, Jessyn, thank you so much for bringing this global and local perspective to this amazingly important issue. And now you better get off and rescue your child, or you're going
I
to be
know.
in a lot
I'm
of
still
other
good. I'm
kind of
not the
trouble.
late mom yet, but I will be soon. I'm not. Nobody wants to be that one. So, all right, thanks, everybody. Talk to you soon.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
much.
Thank you.
All right. I am going to stop the recording and